that indentured servitude was a fantastic way to populate the colonies. They had a right system. It was a great way to establish stability. That it brought people over. It brought people to the colonies. It established stability. It established a labor system that people didn't have to pay. Right? You're not paying these indentured servants. They're just there working. So it established a lot of things in the southern colonies that are going to last forever. Chief amongst them, unpaid labor. Unpaid labor. Second big thing that establishes is this social hierarchy I heard you guys mention yesterday. That there's this plantation owner elite, there's the landowners, and there's the rest of the population that doesn't own land, that just works, that's stuck down here below. So that's what indentured servitude does to us, but I think it's worth pointing out, I love the way you put that, because it's a letter home, and because you said people are dying, this is an unsustainable labor force. And I know, was it Alex that you asked how this is not sustainable, but slavery is? Are slaves riding home? Yeah. Do slaves have a choice? Do slaves get free after 7 years? Yeah, and we'll get into that. So that's the reason why the Virginia colonies switch from indentured servitude to slavery, because slavery is a sustainable labor force that does the exact same thing indentured servitude does, works for free, but there's no expiration, there's no time limit, there's no need for them to sign up, unfortunately. We'll talk about that today. Great question, though.
Wouldn't they agree the strongest?
What's that?
Wouldn't they agree the strongest with the
Yeah, yeah. So today's title is Dissent. What does the word dissent mean? To be mad, to disagree, to argue. Dissent and upheaval. Josue, what does upheaval mean? Upheaval. Santos, what's upheaval mean?
Like a rising conflict.
Rising conflict, chaos. Yeah, good. So, conflict and chaos in colonial American society. So now we're going to kind of go, we zoomed in on the southern colonies, we zoomed in on the New England colonies, we zoomed in on the middle colonies, now we're going to zoom out. Prompt is here, it's a good one. Can you read it please for me, Jonathan?
The labor prompt?
Yeah. It's,
Oh, right. Evaluate the extent to which Bacon's rebellion brought changes to Southern colonial labor system and social classes.
excellent. How much does Bacon's rebellion change who works and social situation and the social classes of the society? All right, it should be a pretty straightforward prompt to answer. Now that we're going to get into some more meaty, big picture lectures, I'll always give you an outline at the beginning for where I'm going. So I think it's helpful for high school students and college students to have a view of what's happening. We'll start today with Bacon's Rebellion and the development of colonial slavery. We'll zoom up north to the New England colonies and talk real quick about the halfway covenant and the Salem witch trials to really get our heads around like this crazy religious fervor that's happening in New England. We'll talk big picture about the Atlantic system, the exchange of goods and people and ideas, transatlantic exchanges. And at the end, we'll talk mercantilism, one of the most important terms of this period, as well as colonial politics. Let's take a look at how and why democracy is developing in the colonies. Any questions about where we're going? Let's go then. So, Bacon's Rebellion, I know you guys read about it, is arguably one of the most important events in colonial development. There's a couple reasons. First, indentured servants start to survive their terms. I told you the first 20 years, 1 in 10 makes it to the end. That one, congratulations. 1 out of 10, you survive. Here's your land. So we're not really having a problem in society with freed indentured servants because they're not being freed, because they're not surviving. However, as conditions improve, as health improves, these people start living out their terms, and then what are they promised? Land. And now they actually have to start being given that land because they're living to the end of their terms. So there's going to be what's developed what's called the frontier. It's a very important theme in American history, and all it is is what's happening on the outskirts of society. So right now, do we live in a rural or an urban area?
Urban.
Super urban. How far do we have to go to a rural area? An hour and a half, 2 hours. Right? Out past like San Bernardino or something. Yeah, take the 10 all the way out. So, and that would be considered like in society, kind of like the frontier. Now, in our world today, that's not the frontier because there's a highway that cuts through and you can get in and back. But in colonial America, and for much of America, the frontier represented where people went in society when they weren't necessarily successful in mainstream world. So if you were a freed indentured servant, where would your land be? On the frontier, right? Out on the outskirts of society, where it's a little more dangerous because you're closer to Native Americans. It's a little less healthy because you're let farther away from like goods and services and exchange. So you're out on the frontier. So this frontier thing, the frontier is an ever-changing place in America. As America expands, just take a look over at the map. Once we really populate the 13 colonies, the frontier is on the edge of the 13 colonies. Once we spread out all the way to the Mississippi River, the frontier is past the Mississippi River. And eventually, once we get to period 6, I'd estimate this will probably be about January 19th, if I'm going to guess. We'll read a speech about how the frontier is closed. There's no more frontier because we've explored all of America, we've settled all of America, and now there's no more frontier. But at the very beginning, the frontier is just what's right outside the Virginia developed place in the world. Frontier is very important. So these former indentured servants that are now surviving and living are on the Virginia frontier. They're out kind of in the middle of nowhere. And they're struggling. They're struggling for 2 reasons. One, prices fall for tobacco. Prices fall for tobacco, which means they're not making as much money as they might have made otherwise. And there's a series of big Indian attacks in the 1670s. Culminating a big attack in 1675. Now, keep in mind, the Indians are going to attack on the frontier because it's less dangerous for the Indians. And that's the place where we see the most contact between white settlers and natives because they're on the frontier. The farmers, these free indentured servants, are going to blame the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley, because he's not helping them. Now, whose fault is this situation? Is it the indentured servant's fault or is it the governor's fault? I'm going to argue it's the governor's fault because they came, they served their time, they got their land, and they're promised a piece of society here in Virginia, and they feel mis- or underrepresented. They feel their voice doesn't matter in Virginia politics because they're just out here on the frontier. The governor's making all the decisions to benefit the rich farmers. Their voice doesn't matter. They're the ones who have to deal with the Indian attacks. Nobody cares about them. They're complaining. Nathaniel Bacon, it's a great name in American history, Bacon. He leads a rebellion in 1676 against Berkeley and a whole bunch of small farmers who were likely mostly freed indentured servants, women who felt they were marginalized, and free African Americans, of which there are many. Because often early in American history in Virginia, slaves are treated like indentured servants and freed after a period of time. It's not yet set in as a system of slavery. Here, although it is in South Carolina, that's going to merge eventually, quite soon. So this proves this point about racial relations, that there's an argument that black people and white people can't get along early in America. No, not true, because they're going to have a rebellion together in Virginia in 1676. They're rebelling against Berkeley, against his policies. They're rebelling for more protection on the frontier, more political voice. But the big thing that's learned is we can't have indentured servants anymore because eventually they get freed and they get angry. So if we look at why this system, this is a great infographic for you. Early, white indentured servitude is going to go from about 1607 to 1650 here, and it's very high mortality. They're all dying, so it doesn't matter. Because they're not living out their terms, we don't have to give them land, they're dead anyway. Unfortunately, or fortunately, if you're an indentured servant, there's this transition from 1650 to 1725 Bacon's Rebellion happens kind of right in the middle of it. It's kind of a speeding up of the process, in which these people are now there's a declining mortality. People are living longer. So now we're going to start shifting our labor from white indentured servants who have to be freed and given something at the end to African slaves and African American slaves who don't ever get freed and are promised nothing at the end. So from a humanity nature, this is really messed up. But from a business decision, this makes logical sense because you want to do what these people did, but not have to give them the benefit of these people, hence the transition to African slaves. The Africans are already there. They are present. They are accessible via the triangle trade. They are accessible via the Caribbean. There's plenty of supply, and what Bacon's Rebellion does is it increases the demand. Bacon's Rebellion increases demand for slaves. The supply was already there. Now we have race-based slavery, which is going to really begin taking hold in the 1720s, and it's going to gradually increase all the way through American history until it's abolished with the Civil War in the 1860s. So for the next 140 years, Americans are going to have the benefit of indentured servitude without the disadvantage of having to pay them at the end. And again, my argument becomes, they went there to get rich. They got rich on the backs of indentured servants. Once that system went away, they replaced it with something that got them richer. Why you go somewhere impacts what you do when you get there. So big picture, the significance of the rebellion itself. The rebellion fails. It does not work. Several rebels are killed. The settlement of Jamestown is burned. William Berkeley, the governor, has to flee, but the rebellion still fails. Rebels are killed. But the significance is that for labor in the Virginia and Southern colonies, the large plantation owners begin looking to slavery instead, because they know they won't have to pay them at the end with land. White indentured servants are seen as too troublesome, too much work. God forbid you give somebody money for their work or land for their work. And it's going to demonstrate a new thing that's going to be, it's one of your reading questions. It's a new issue that's going to be an issue for the next forever in American history. I'd argue up to today. That it demonstrates the social, economic, class differences between urban and rural. Today, urban cities usually vote which direction? Left, liberal, Democratic. Rural areas usually vote Republican, right, conservative. That's going to continue throughout American history. The rural areas feel underrepresented and they feel angry about it. And then planters, these rich slave owners, are going to start relying on racism to make sure that the poor whites who would have been rebelling here are now on their side for not economic reasons, racist reasons. Let's talk about this for a second. Yes, sir.
When did the scientific racism thing happen?
That's going to happen more in the 1800s. As more of a So now there's this argument, right? Like if you four are poor white people, welcome to my world, it's lovely, and you four are free African Americans. You guys with me so far? Are they going to rebel together in Bacon's Rebellion? Yeah, they do. So if I'm the rich plantation owner, the only way I can make sure that we divide the two sides is they have a lot in common economically. They both struggle economically. So we're going to use racism as the divide to wedge the two groups. And if I can convince them that they should be against them for racist reasons, even though they have a lot in common economically, I win because the society stays divided. Interesting. So now what would be a logical connection in these two groups is no longer a connection because of racist reasons. American History 101. If we can keep the lower classes divided on racial issues, it allows them to not come together for shared economic struggle, shared social struggle, shared political struggle, shared personal struggle. Thanks, Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion tells us, as a society, is, oh crap, this is a class issue, not a race issue. But if we can make it a race issue, the class issue we can ignore. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Almost too much sense, huh? So now there's this manipulative racism to make sure that these two groups stay separate from each other over racist issues, even though economically they should be coming together to ask for the same changes. Rinse, repeat for the entirety of, especially in the South, American history. We see poor whites who own no slaves defending slavery fiercely before the Civil War. Why? Slavery keeps them poor. They're the ones who can't afford to compete because they don't own slaves, because they feel they're better than somebody else. It's not all, some of it's pride, but a lot of it's just racism. So we see this increase in slavery here. We see an increase in slavery because of a couple of reasons. Big picture, we should know all of these. Simple math. Indentured servants decrease, slavery increases. Now you can make the argument that, I don't know, maybe the southern plantation owners could have just started paying their labor. That makes too much sense. Indentured servitude declines for a couple reasons. One is what you guys just read. The life sucks. It's all terrible. Bacon's Rebellion, second reason. But third reason, the English economy is doing well. So people are doing better in England, they're less likely to sign up for this miserable experience for 7 years in America. If you have no hope, indentured servitude offers hope. But if you have hope, why would you sign up for that? You don't. The increase in the availability of slaves allows for an increase in supply. Prices go down for slaves. The Royal African Company had a monopoly. That monopoly ends, allowing for more slaves to be imported. When there's more of something, when something is more widely available, does the price go up or down? Down. Supply and demand. When there's a lot of something, the price goes down. So when there's a lot of slaves we bought, the price goes down. Like I told you, there's this fear of a huge number of landless free whites. These freed indentured servants. And there's a huge available supply of slaves from the Caribbean. That South Carolinian Barbados culture that I talked about a couple classes ago. Now, as slavery grows, so too does resistance to slavery by the slave. Once slaves realize that slavery is becoming an entrenched societal system, we see plenty of examples of slave rebellions. Later we're going to look at the defense of slavery from the white perspective. Heather can tell us about it from African Studies last year, where the white population is saying, no, slavery's good for the slave. It's better here than Africa. Josue was in that class, he knows. And my argument to that is always like, well, then why the hell were they always rebelling and trying to run away? Right? You can't fool us with your idiocy. We see that one of the biggest slave rebellions happening early, 1739 in, of all places, the worst place in America, South Carolina. No? It's the first of many examples which I'll tell you that South Carolina is the worst place in America. Don't go there. Right? South Carolina has a huge slave rebellion, hundreds of slaves. It's very successful. They burn a bunch of villages. They're trying to get from South Carolina, they're trying to get to Spanish Florida because they'd be free in Spanish Florida. The rebellion fails. They're all hung, put to death, decapitated, with their heads displayed in society to remind the other slaves, this is what happens when you rebel. And every time a slave rebellion takes place, restrictions on slaves get tighter. You rebel, you're almost successful, well, you just lost your right to read, to communicate in written language, to express your culture. So every time there's a rebellion, restrictions get tighter. Yes, sir?
Why do they think going by water?
By water? Because how they can go by water?
Steal a boat.
Steal a boat? There's a lot of them. They don't know exactly where they're going. They just know that Florida is south. They can go south. They can get to Florida. So it's not so much why did it fail, it's the fact that it's attempted. Yes, sir?
But it says deported right there. What was it deported?
Am I there yet?
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
1741, 106 slaves are hung or deported due to a rumor that slaves are planning to burn New York City. They're deported back to the Caribbean, where slave culture is quote-unquote works. And slaves running away are common. So it's where we get our mind around like why slavery develops and the fact that it doesn't develop without resistance from the slave community. So it's also important to understand the culture. That in places like the Chesapeake and the South, there are so many slaves that slaves are able to maintain much of their culture. Because there are so many of them, we see very present an African culture that will very quickly become a modified version of African culture that we'll call African American culture. Now, it's impossible for African slaves to maintain their exact identity because white population is pulling African slaves from a variety of different regions of Africa with different cultures and putting them all into the same slave system, into a melting pot type of situation. But what comes out of this is African American culture, which is incredibly strong to this day in many places of the South that had huge African populations. By 1720, the African population in America, in the American colonies, is self-sustaining. Meaning there's no need to import new slaves because the slaves that are here are already living long enough and having enough children that the population will not die off on its own. This feature is unique to the American colonies. In the Caribbean, in these islands that I pointed out a couple classes ago, down here, and in South America, this is not true. Anybody know why not?
Yeah.
Why?
Slaves would work hard and they would often die.
Yeah, so they're worked hard regardless. Sir?
The overall health and sanitation of the colonies.
The overall health of the colonies is greater than that of the Caribbean or South America. It's not quite as hot, humid, and tropical disease-wise. And just in general, it's a more advanced society that values life. I'm not saying they don't value them as people, but they value the life of slaves because in the American colonies, they realized that a slave that's going to live longer is going to provide more value. So there's no point in beating them to death because then you're losing an investment. You beat them close to death, and then you maintain your investment. So very, very, very sad. And in all, you could argue that without Bacon's Rebellion, this doesn't happen, but it's a straw man argument, so there's no way to tell. At some point, indentured servitude was not going to be a system anymore, and slavery was going to replace it. The population of the Chesapeake, Virginia, in the mid-1700s is 40% African American. 40% of people living in Virginia are slaves. In South Carolina, it's 60%. There are more slaves than white people in South Carolina for about 80 years. Think about that. That's insane. That you have a white society that has more slaves than white people. I'm not saying slave owners, I'm saying white slave owners, white farm owners, white landless people, men, women, children, more slaves by a 6 to 10 ratio of all of them. We see far, far, far fewer slaves in New England and far fewer slaves in the middle colonies. Places like Pennsylvania, not for slavery, but that makes sense given what you read about Pennsylvania. It's a place of tolerance and Quaker principles and value of human life, and they're paying Native Americans for their land. Not a place for slavery. New York, limited slavery, but some. Massachusetts, very limited slavery, but some. And we'll see the slavery really phasing out in those places as it gets more increased in the South. Now, I heard a teacher once, a real teacher, say there was no slavery in the North. False statement. But we got to get past those overgeneralizations. That's like saying that they came here for religious freedom. No, they came here for freedom of their religion. Very different. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the South's bad because slavery, the North's good because no slavery. No, the North is still incredibly racist. The North still has a presence of slavery. It just pales in comparison to what we see in the Chesapeake, which even there pales in comparison to what we see in the South, the Deep South. Here are my slave demographics for you. Take 30 seconds, talk to your partner, make some observations about the map that you see. Go.
South Carolina.
Pennsylvania, Connecticut,
America's still racist. I don't know. We'll find out in the other class, won't we?
There's
You can't say it in all these people are racist. There's people that are racist. It's like people say white people are racist. I'm racist.
Is the north the state that has the most
It's already spread out.
in the north,
So right now, all we have is that Georgia,
but in the south
there.
there's no state that has the most.
Cool. Great question. All right, guys. Observations. Let me hear from. I'll get to you. I hear from a lot of you. That's a good thing. Thank you.
Me and Zane were talking about how in the South, like for example, Georgia, South Carolina, their slave percentage is over 60 or higher.
Yeah.
While places like Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire have less than 5%.
Now,
I mean,
yeah. Less than 5%. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, all have less than, and Rhode Island. Connecticut's a little higher. Sorry. Under 10 though. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, all under 10%. Question for you. Should this surprise us? No. Ruby, why not?
Well, one, they didn't even have farm. They weren't really big on farming, so
That's a big point.
they weren't very agricultural, so they didn't really have a need for slaves. And the other is that they were more democratic and kind of more liberal up there.
Okay. Well, Pennsylvania is huge on farming, right? Wheat, oats, oatmeal, the Quakers. So you're right. But Pennsylvania is a huge farming colony, the breadbasket of the colonies. And even as the breadbasket colony, they're not relying on slavery. So it's both, to your point. It's the fact they're not relying on farming here, and here where they are relying on farming, their ideals are such that they don't resort to unpaid labor to do it. This trend is going to continue. More slaves than white people in South Carolina. This trend is going to continue. And then what we're going to see as America develops, slavery is going to have a slight decrease as tobacco decreases. And the founding fathers are going to have this argument like, should we outlaw slavery or should we just let it die on its own? It's going to die on its own anyway. Just let it be, not to piss people off. And then boom, cotton. And now slavery has a whole next birth of skyrocketing this as we spread cotton into the deep south of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, New Orleans, Tennessee, Arkansas as well. So, and it's important that we understand that Bacon's Rebellion, we cannot say Bacon's Rebellion causes this, because that's not fair. That oversimplifies things. But Bacon's Rebellion is the spark that precipitates a rapid shift from indentured servitude to slavery. Now up north in New England, somebody asked last class about the halfway covenant. Worth pointing out as well, as this is one of their versions of upheaval. The halfway covenant is passed in 1662, and it calms down Massachusetts' religious restrictions. That whole John Winthrop, like, I'm watching you. We're a city on a hill. We're all watching each other. If you blink the wrong way, where are we going to send her? Rhode Island. Rhode Island. Yeah, or hell is Rhode Island. Not the damn sewer. You weren't here for the sewer talk. You might have been in a sewer. Anyway, it is a compromise. The halfway covenant, it's saying it's okay if you're a halfway Puritan. If you're a halfway Puritan, you can still participate in our democratic process. Remember, in New England, you need to be a church member to be involved in politics. What it's saying is now you can be a halfway church member and be involved in politics. It's less strict regulations, and it's caused kind of by logic. These first generation Puritans are dying off. The second and third generation Puritans are growing up, and they are less radical, less extreme. But let's think about the logic here too. This is all logical. The Puritans that are born here, they weren't exposed to the crazy corruption of the Church of England. They weren't exposed to having to travel across the ocean to establish a city on a hill. They weren't exposed to that pressure. So they grew up like, whatever, like, let's calm down a little bit. Is this any different than immigration today?
What?
That over generations you become less like what brought or what culture came here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many of your parents or grandparents yell at you for not speaking Spanish enough, for example?
I hear that.
See? Hey, Brett, did I yell at you for that, bro? Not that much. Only a little bit. So, mine either, bro. Mine either. My Irish family's all like, eat more potatoes. So, it's true, though, that it's important. Like, let's just apply some logic to this situation that our second and third generations are less radical about what they're really passionate about early. It's a liberalization. Also, shortly after this, we've got a little too liberal. And we have the New England religion and the Salem witch trials, which are just a kind of a fun yet terrifying example of religious fervor in the colonies. These young women are acting strangely. We assume that they are possessed by demons, which is always my explanation when a young woman is acting strangely. Clearly you are possessed by demons. And they accused these young women are acting strangely, and they accuse an African slave and 2 local white women of practicing witchcraft. Yes?
Why did they kill 2 dogs?
That's a great question. Those dogs were probably acting strangely. The dogs were obviously possessed as well. That's a great question. Everybody pointed that out in the book, like, this is all cool and all, but why we gotta kill dogs? Nobody cares about killing these 141 women, 44 men. That's terrible. The 14 women die, 15 men die, whatever, it happens. But the dogs?
It's sad killing.
Yeah, they had a weird bark. Obviously, they were possessed. Yeah. But big picture, what I want you to understand here is this demonstrates the religious nature of New England, because all it took was an accusation, and all of a sudden it's hysterical. People are going crazy. People are put to death with just subjective evidence, which is no concrete evidence, but just hearsay, and people die over it. People die over it, and what this does is the controversy weakens this crazy Puritan control in New England, this religious hold on New England. It weakens that because of this controversy, and it allows New England to become less religious and just more naturally democratic. So the democracy that was intertwined within the church, the Puritan church, and the town assemblies, the Puritan church loses some of that influence, but the democracy stays. So the liberal parts of New England survive. The religious hold in the liberal parts falls off some. It's like, and now we say a witch hunt or a witch trial for anything that have like some crazy accusations now. Right, our current president is accusing the media of a witch hunt for finding out all these shady things he did. Or you just did shady things. One or the other. So they weaken this Puritan influence and control, and New England is a little more democratic and a little less religious control. Now what I want you to do is I have 2 perspectives on Puritanism. Now this is your first preview for a little bit of what the short answer questions look like on the AP test. So let me explain. What you'll get for one of the 3 SAQs every year is 2 historians with their researched perspective on the same issue. In this case, it's the Puritans. What you'll have to do, yes sir?
Are they always different?
Always. That's the idea. What you have to do is you have to read them, and for part A, not today, but for the actual test, for part A, you're going to identify what is their different points of view regarding blank, Brenda. So in this case, if this was an actual AP question, it would say, what is the difference in point of view regarding the Puritans? A. B. What is one specific piece of evidence that backs up the first perspective? C. What is one specific piece of evidence that backs up the second perspective? So you're not saying which one's right or wrong. You're just applying the history you know to both perspectives. For today's purpose, I just want you to do the A part. Read these 2 opinions, these 2 historians, not only their researched opinions, and tell me how do they differ in their view of the Puritans. I'm going to give you 6 entire minutes to read them carefully, identify what the different points of view are, and then we'll chop it up on the board after that. Time's ticking, keep going. Is that good or bad? It should never feel like that. Scratch will always go good.
I like this class.
And hopefully I'm entertaining and informative. That helps. I'm not just rambling on like
We would never.
and we finished our package. You're reading on your own, guys. I don't want to be strict like the Puritans. Gonna maximize that time. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you guys are really good. Last year's kids, 2 out of 3 average on the SAT they had, but stimulus. Yeah, good. Dog assertion. Strong belief that if we all work together, intellectually and spiritually, that will keep down like democracy because like the church is very strong. Which is not really democratic at all. There you go. All right, from the sound of things. Look, dude, if he's not done writing, then you should be done. It's on you for talking. It goes both ways. Hold each other accountable. Take another 30 seconds to identify just what's their difference in point of view. Hey, if you keep turning around, we're going to have issues. Don't be sorry, just don't do it. All right, so what is the main point of view here in the Puritans by Miller and Johnson? What is their point of view about the Puritans? I'm going to go here because I know you have a good answer. Speak to us, nice and loud.
So Miller and Johnson, they believe that, they see Puritanism as like a form of domination and form of like selfish government, where they make it seem like the others have a choice, but in reality they assert their views onto others and make it or have the ruling that they wanted.
Damn right. They're pointing out that the Puritans aren't democratic at all. There's the appearance of democracy, but by pointing it out in a stratified social situation, by making sure that it's only the properly educated who are really in charge, it's a very undemocratic system at all. And it doesn't matter, there's this rising tide of democratic sentiments, but this belief that the church is going to hold that down. The autocracy of Puritan control is going to hold down the rising tide of lower class democracy. Huh. Well, in New England, who gets to vote and hold power? That's not a rich situation. Church members. Where does one get educated in New England? Within the church. Early. Later, we're going to split into public schools. So the argument here is that, yeah, it's democratic. If you're a church member, that domino, domino, domino. That really, the Puritan system is a social stratification. The church leadership is also the educated, and therefore, like I told you, there's the Puritan control on democracy. It's a good point. What is Hall's point? Who wants to take a shot at it? Go for it.
He's really saying that the clergyman,
Louder.
he's trying to say that the traditions, like in the beliefs, like they're not really dominant.
Okay.
The word dominant doesn't really describe who they are. It's like they're like more open to other people. It's like they're just trying to help other people, like spreading their beliefs towards them.
So here he's saying that they're not democratic enough, and here that he's almost saying that they're too democratic. That there's too much connection between it, because the church members have to like raise you up in the ways of Christ and also rule you. Interesting. Who's right? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because we can find historical evidence that backs up this perspective and that backs up this perspective. So get your head out of the who's right situation and think what has happened, what are the developments that back this up and this up. You could say John Winthrop, City on a Hill, also Ann Hutchinson, Roger Williams fits here. Very much so. Agreed? Doesn't that back up the point that there's no real democracy? You don't like us, we kick you out? There you go. Moral of the story. Good. Good. So you get used to that idea of reading two historians' perspectives and trying to figure out, like, what do I know that backs up both of these opinions? It's not about who's right, it's about backing them both up. I was telling some people in the front that on last year's, because you guys know every assurance question, as those of you who took AP World, has 3 parts, yes? You get 1 point for A, 1 point for B, 1 point for C. So in order to really do well in assurance questions, you should try to get 1 for every question and 2 for 1 or 2 of them, and you do pretty well. Last year, on all my 62 kids, 60-some kids, 62 kids, on the SAQ with the stimuli, so that one you just saw, the average for all 60 kids was 2. Which means half my kids got at least 3, got 2 or 3, which is awesome. So the more we do of these, the data backs up, the better we do on them. The best part is part A is simply, can you read? Can you read, as long as you're comfortable about how it's going to work, can you read historically and tell me what the difference is in the two views? Done. Most of you can read. It's crazy. Luis is here as well. So despite this idea of salutary neglect, which we'll get into in the next couple of classes, there are some small attempts by England to get a little bit more control on the colonies, specifically in New England. King James II created what's called the Dominion of New England. It's important. He put all of New England together under this Dominion so that administratively they'd control all of them under one. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, parts of New York, and New Jersey. Just the eastern part, excuse me. In charge is going to be Edmund Andros. He's appointed by the king to run the New England colonies. We see some significant revolts in 1689 in Boston, 1689 in New York. And what happens is this governor is overthrown. In New York, they rebel quite significantly in 1689. And what happens instead is England says, fine, we'll leave you alone. What this demonstrates, though, is that England wasn't entirely hands-off to colonies. It's just that when they put their hands on, the colonies resisted to a point that it wasn't worth their trouble. And I'll get to why in a moment. So, there's this theory of thinking that the colonies were just left alone forever. That's not true, necessarily. The Dominion of New England is good counter-evidence to that, but it's unsuccessful. Cool. So we're in good shape right now, time-wise. Take a look at this map with your table partner, please. What does this map reveal about demographics and diversity in British North America, and why does that matter? Take two. Take a look. If you can't see, feel free to get a little closer. Pink is Scots Irish. So Scotland. Sir. In a sense, yes, but this is more so than like people from other countries in America are taking this less
It's very
in a sense, more of the are actually from England, so that's going to be more so like, and by now that's basically done as a system. This is 1750s, so that's going to be more like in that region. But even then, they're going to be pushed out eventually as well by the normal figure landowners.
What's the most labor you see is in the South?
West is that way?
We're looking at it in
East, south,
Oh, yeah.
All right, 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, and 1. So, I know, like I told you guys last class, like this looks like diversity, but it's a lot of different flavors of white people. We got the white flavor, the other white flavor, the other white flavor, the vanilla bean flavor, the white flavor, right? But at the time, right, we got French vanilla, vanilla bean, white vanilla, the budget vanilla, this is Scots Irish. So at the time, though, this is very diverse. This is very diverse. This is situations that cause a lot of trouble in Europe, but here we are in the American colonies, and there's cultures that are really just mixed in together. What does this tell us? Any of this? That's the question I asked in the first place. Go for it.
From what I've seen in the map, it seems like
Louder.
from what I've seen in the map, it looks like the South is a little more diverse, and the Scottish Irish they probably had a good relationship with the native because
not a bad assumption. Okay? Eli, what else does this tell us? Okay. Brett, what do you think?
I wrote the same thing as what you said.
Okay.
More, that it was more diverse, like different types of people towards the southern region.
Kind of. But I think it's more important to say there's more diversity on the frontier. That's more important. Than here on the less developed part of society, that's where the non-British people are settling. In the north, it's largely German people. In this chunk of Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River. Along the Hudson River, it's a ton. In New York, it's largely Dutch, which makes sense. It was originally a Dutch colony. The Scots-Irish along the Appalachian Mountains, along the ridge of the colonies, quite present. And then the German people are along in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania as well, again, on the frontier. We see yellow chunks here, a huge chunk, and here a huge chunk, yellow being slaves. And it doesn't surprise us, because that's Jamestown and the Virginia colony, and that's Charleston, where all of the slave culture is being imported from Barbados. And that's spreading through South Carolina there. So big picture, like none of this should surprise us, but it is helpful to get our mind around the fact that it's not just people from England. It's not just the British people. All right. So now we should have a nice big understanding of everybody at this point. We have our southern colonies and our Chesapeake colonies, our lower south Chesapeake that all fits in the southern label, our middle colonies, and our New England colonies. But still, population is quite spread out. You look at what's settled. We have this little area that's settled, this area that's settled, a lot of settlement here, a lot of settlement here, but not a lot of people still, compared to what's going to happen. So post-1700 is when we see our huge push of people. In 1701, there's only about 250,000 people in British North America. That's not a lot. 250,000. 75 years later, it's 2.5 million. So even when we look at this map, people aren't really settled much anywhere except a lot in Virginia, a lot here on the East Coast, and a lot on the shore of New England. By 1775, a year before the American Revolution, it's 2.5 million people. So in that 75 years, population is going to skyrocket. Population skyrockets for two reasons. One is a ton of migration, voluntary migration, forced migration. The second reason is a very high birth rate. People are having more kids in the colonies because there's more land, there's more space, there's more need for people. Whereas in Europe, everything's more constrained and confined, and there's less opportunity. And people are still coming for religious reasons, for economic reasons, and because of political turmoil. We're going to see English, as I told you, English people coming all over the place. Germans are really going into Pennsylvania, as are the Dutch, Scottish, Irish, Dutch, Swedish. But again, what do all these people have in common? They're all immigrants. Yes, agreed. What else do they have in common? They're all white as hell. Yeah, they're all windshield white. Real white. Real white. I got a little tan this summer for a couple days. It's really exciting. And of course, the forced migration of Africans coming here suffering discrimination and slave labor. Now we are in good shape. Lifestyles. Some characteristics we should note. 80% of colonists are farmers. Yeah. Almost every American is a farmer. And compared to Europeans, by 1775, Americans actually have a higher standard of living. Wages are higher. Life expectancy is higher. Land ownership is a higher percentage. People are more successful. That's why they're coming in America than in Europe. Land is really cheap. That's a big pull. And wages are high. Now, some of the characteristics that all the colonists share, they are mostly English, which makes sense. Mostly English. They believe in British freedoms. You guys should remember, learned last year the English Bill of Rights, which I just talked about in AP Gov today. English Bill of Rights. They are largely self-governed. From a political sense, England is largely keeping their hands off of the colonies. I think that's on the back page, your last set of questions. So you can pick over. They're largely self-governed for the most part, especially compared to Europe. There's religious toleration. For the most part, especially compared to Europe, there is religious toleration. There's more educational opportunities, more economic opportunities, and they're beginning to develop an identity that is separate from Great Britain because of the lack of a monarchy. There's no king, queen, figurehead in America. They're largely left alone. As you saw, populations kind of spread out. So each pocket is kind of governing themselves, leading to this idea of self-rule, of colonial democracy. As the years go by, they become less and less and less British and more American. And we'll talk about that. You'll read about that this weekend, actually. Or Monday morning, first thing, if you so choose.
They had some of that for that.
Yeah, some of that there that will continue. That's kind of the idea, is that we start seeing a little more of a break from the British identity and a little more development of a unique American identity. Now, demographics are super important. As I just told you, population rises rapidly. Women are playing a key role. That's 2 sorries. You want a 3rd sorry? Me either. Women are playing a key role in family life, but it still is a largely male-dominated society. Classes in the New World are more blurred than classes in the Old World. There is more social mobility in the colonies than we have in Europe. In England, if you're born rich, in general, how do you die? Rich. If you're born poor, you die poor. In the American colonies, there's more blurring of the lines. Right? The rich are still obviously the rich, especially in the South, the slave-holding elite, but the lines other places are more blurred. There's very little diversity in the North, because it's mostly English, very few slaves, mostly family-driven. But, as we talked about on our grid yesterday, the middle colonies breed diversity. They breed diversity. English, German, Swedes, Dutch, Irish, Scotch-Irish. Oh, we got some Jews. Some slaves, and very family-driven. Because those are where our big seaports are. That's where our immigrants are accessing to come in. It becomes a very diverse place. And again, in the southern colonies, it's still English, some German, some Scots-Irish, more men, some families, some indentured servitude, and a growing slave population. So not much diversity, ton of diversity. But that's okay, because they came, didn't they come for homogeneity? What kind of homogeneity? Religious homogeneity. Religious sameness. They came for economic sameness. They came for a variety of reasons, hence diversity. Right? It's not illogical. A lot of it just kind of makes sense. Now, from a political standpoint, this also really matters because all 3 have democracy developing, but all 3 have a slightly different twist or taste of democracy. Bless you. In New England, it's much more of a direct democracy. Church members have a vote on every issue. You guys want to try direct democracy? Let's give it a go. All right, on the count of 3, if you can pick anything for lunch, what are you having? 1, 2, 3. Perfect, direct democracy. Isn't it great? Cool. Just kidding, I don't really care what you want. Now, that's direct democracy, where everybody has a say, and it's an equal say, and it sounds really cool in theory, except now we can't figure out what we want for lunch. Okay, now I get it. You're excited about food. Pump the brakes. Cool. Cool, send her in. That's fine too. Thank you, ma'am. So, direct democracy, does it work?
Yeah.
Sure. What are we having for lunch?
We don't know.
We don't know. Alex, stay with me. In the middle colonies, don't finish that turn.
Oh, I thought you were
Yeah, because she's the one turning around every 9 minutes. No. That's you. Middle colonies are more built on assemblies that are much more like England. Let's try this. U7. Who do you think is your representative? Who's the most qualified person in these 7 people? Ilya. All right, cool. Stay with me. They've picked Eli. What do we have for lunch? There we go. We're having chicken and rice. Never mind. Too bad. Too bad. That's your representative. And in the southern colonies, it's much more based on wealth and plantation ownership, but again, still in representative form. This will play a role later. Talking about the Gov today. Democracy, republic, republic. Democracy, everybody has a say. Republic, you pick your leaders, and they have a say for you. Now in the U.S. today, we have a democratic republic, so on some issues, we have a direct say. On other issues, all representatives make our decisions for us. But it's unique to understand that the identity of each colony impacts how they form their democracy. They're based on common good, all for all, equality, God. So of course, direct democracy. And they're based on getting rich. So of course, the rich are going to make the decisions. Super social stratification. In the middle colonies, they're from a variety of perspectives, rich, middle, poor, so they figure out a way to make that work for them. But their colonial identity impacts their colonial democracy to a great extent. So democracy in the colonies in general, they do have a form of a limited self-government. Each colony is picking legislative assemblies. Some colonies get to pick their governors. Other colonies, England picks their governor for them. It doesn't really matter. These governors are largely useless. And a lot of the colonies are really driven by local politics. Local politics. In general, voting is limited to adult males that are either educated in the north, property owners in the south. Adult males who meet some sort of qualification. However, in these colonies, we see the development early of freedom of expression. You need to note in your notes the John Peter Zenger case, in which a New York newspaperman published critiques of the government. They tried to put him in jail, and their local court system in New York said no, because there's the freedom of expression. So the freedom of the press becomes a very early foundation of American democracy, which comes off of this Zenger trial in 1735 in New York. Yeah, so he publishes in his local newspaper critiques of the New York government. And they try to get him in trouble for it, and the courts in New York say, no, you can't, because there's this freedom of expression. All right, my last piece for today then is economics. So I know economics can get boring and dry sometimes, but I need you to stay with me and understand that this idea of mercantilism is super, super, super important. Hector's agreeing. So in general, the British are fully ignoring what the colonies are doing from a political, social, and economic standpoint. Politically, left alone. Colonial assemblies, House of Burgesses, town hall meetings, whatever the hell you want. Left alone. Socially, have slaves. Don't have slaves. Do whatever you want. Left alone socially. Economically, grow your stuff, do your thing, do whatever the hell you want. So in the 1650s, the colonies are not state-funded. England's not paying for the colonies. England's not protecting the colonies. They're largely left alone. However, Charles II, in 1660, begins to assert control on the colonies, not politically, not socially, economically. Salutary neglect is going to stay as a policy, politically and socially, for much of the 1600s and 1700s. Economically, England's going to say, as long as we can make money from you, we will leave you alone. Or they're going to make money off of this idea of mercantilism. To maximize exports, to decrease imports, and generate more government revenue. Mercantilism is just this. The less I, as a country, have to import, the more successful I am economically. I'll say it again. The less I have to bring in from other countries, the more successful I will become. Vice versa, the more I can sell to other countries, the more successful I will become. Think about that. If I have to buy, what does the U.S. have to buy right now from other countries? Oil. Some tech. Does it become more or less expensive if you buy it from somebody else? More expensive. So check it out. If England is buying it or bringing it in from the colonies, are they importing it? Ruby, why not? Because you're right. It's their land. So England is saying, like, if I can get tobacco from the colonies, if I can get timber from the colonies, if I can get sugar from the colonies, I'm not buying it from France. I'm not buying it from Spain. I'm not buying it from the Dutch. I'm getting it from within my empire. Hence, mercantilism going hand in hand with imperialism. If you can't grow it or make it yourself, you go create a colony that can for you. You go create a colony that can for you, and then you're not buying it from your competitors, you're getting it from yourself. Mercantilism. It's an economic policy that looked upon trade, colonies, and the accumulation of wealth as the basis for a country's strength. A government should regulate trade and production to enable any country to be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency is the key. If you can't grow it yourself, get a colony that can. If you can't make it yourself, get a colony that can. Colonies' only job in this equation, this is key because it's going to play a huge role later. The colony's job is to provide raw materials. Hilda, what's an example of a raw material?
Yeah, cotton, like anything that like you can use
Sure.
to make other
Cotton is a raw material. What is a manufactured good that comes from cotton? You're not Hilda. Hilda's way cooler than you are. What do we make out of cotton?
clothes.
Clothes! This is a manufactured good, even though he's wearing it the wrong way. He's not wearing a bunch of cotton balls. He's wearing a shirt made of cotton. Sugar. Raw material. Tobacco. Raw material. Cigarettes. Manufactured good. Wood. Raw material. Desk. Manufactured good. Trees are also... The trees are manufactured good? Yeah, but you have it. Next week we're going to take a field trip to the tree factory. It's going to be great. And then... So yeah, exactly. So we are going to send England raw materials. We are going to, as the colonies, buy back manufactured goods.
Yeah,
We're going to buy back manufactured goods. Mercantilism 101. It looks like this. Here's a nice, those of you that are visual learners. We want the colonies provide any raw material to the mother country and buy back manufactured goods. Now who does that screw economically? Colonies. Because now they're buying back their manufactured goods at a higher price. But in return, they're going to get protection, they're part of the empire, and they're left alone politically and socially. Mercantilism 101. So colonies provide raw materials, parent country makes products, sends them back. And now England can be economically self-sufficient. They don't need to rely on France, they don't need to rely on the Dutch, on the Spanish, on anyone else, because everything is within their own empire. Nice try, buddy. Yeah. So mercantilism really is the foundation for England's empire. They want more money, they want a better balance of trade, they want to eliminate the Dutch, they want a stronger navy. All of it goes in hand with mercantilism. How are they going to enforce mercantilism? The two really important acts that actually restrict colonial trade. Two examples of non-salutary neglect. The Navigation Act of 1660 and the Navigation Act of 1663. Now in 1660, they rule that no ship couldn't trade with the colonies unless it's a ship made in England. So now they're consolidating their ship making. To not be using Spanish ships, Dutch ships, French ships. Yes?
So the Spanish get an English ship, okay.
Let's keep going. In theory, there, in 63, no. So if the Spanish want to buy an English ship and ship English goods, sure. But the Spanish would never do that. And then all these raw materials that are called enumerated goods, it's a good term, enumerated goods, enumerated goods, enumerated goods. Tobacco, sugar, cotton, rice, rosin, tar. If the colonists were going to sell them, they could only send them to English ports. That rules out your Spanish idea, right? So sure, if the Spanish want to get a British ship and send it to Britain, sure, but that doesn't make any sense. Good question, though. So anything the colonists are going to sell has to go to England. In 1663, any good shipped to the English colonies, whatever it is, if it's from another country, it's from India, Spain, France, whatever. If it's going to go to the colonies, it has to go through a British port first. So it gets taxed in the British port and gets more expensive in the colonies. Mercantilism. Yeah, good for them. So then it looks like this. These raw materials, lumber, tobacco, rice, indigo, furs, they're going from all the colonies back to England. Manufactured goods are coming back. So in New England, they're sending fish, furs, naval stores, back manufactured goods. Chesapeake, tobacco, back manufactured goods. Southern colonies, rice, indigo, hides, back manufactured goods. Yes, sir.
It's not sound dumb, right?
It might.
Yeah. Like the Bermuda Triangle is right there, right?
Yeah, right there. The Bermuda Triangle, because that's relevant to Avery.
No, I'm just saying.
Just saying. Here's a simpler look that with largely British-controlled trade, we have this. But with American-controlled trade, America's trying to get their slaves, send their rum, trade with Spain. Can the blue things exist? What after the Navigation Acts? No. Question: do they still exist?
No.
Yes. The Americans largely ignore the Navigation Acts because they're very difficult to enforce. Yeah. But it's important we understand that England's not just leaving them alone. They're trying to use the colonists for profit as much as possible. So there are some benefits and disadvantages because the Acts of Trade and Navigation in 1660 and 1663. A couple benefits. One, New England gets really good and really profitable at shipbuilding. If we have to sell it on British ships, we can build British ships. We're British. We're in the British Empire. We'll build the ships. New England prospers greatly on shipbuilding. Two, they get military protection from the French and the Spanish. So the colonies are able to thrive economically because they have military safety. However, the two negatives, the colonies never industrialize. Because why would they? They can't. Their job is to send raw materials and buy back manufactured goods. So at the eve of the American Revolution, the American colonies have very, very, very little manufacturing capabilities. Because they've always been relying on their mother country. Right? It's like if I never ask you to work independently at all, and then I send you off to college, like, you're going to be unsuccessful. Because you've never had to do it on your own. The colonies have never had to do it on their own because they've always had England to manufacture their goods. And it causes colonists to pay higher prices for manufactured goods because of this mercantilism equation. It's fancy. Oh, that's cool. It's a bear. Looks kind of like you. So benefit, benefit, disadvantage, disadvantage. But that's the way mercantilism works. That's the way mercantilism is going to work. Right. 17 minutes. So, big picture. This is my summary. I think finish this thread of the colonial identity, who they are. Big picture. Dukes don't emigrate is a phrase. Dukes don't emigrate. Why not? Because they're wealthy. So America is filled with lower and middle class people from Europe that are looking for a new life for the most part. Obviously there's exceptions. John Winthrop was an exception, but he didn't come for economic reasons, he came for religious reasons. That's why he's the exception. The social classes in America are more blurred than social classes in Britain. The diversity in America is more diverse than diversity in Britain. The democracy in America is more democratic than the democracy in Britain. And property in America is much cheaper than property in Europe. For pretty logical reasons, I think. There's more land, there's more democracy, there's less control by the monarchy, they're good to go. Good. Good, good, good. So take just I'll give you 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And tell me, just real quick at the bottom, evaluate the extent to which Bacon's Rebellion brought change in the Southern colonial labor system and social classes. So give me just a good one-sentence summary, because I'm going to introduce the short answer questions, the last 15 minutes of class. That answers for me how much did Bacon's Rebellion change social systems and labor systems and social classes. We got 15 minutes left. But I got a short answer question. It goes fast now. Yeah, should answer that real quick in a thesis statement.